The Clone Wars raged across 1,000 systems. The Jedi were stretched thin. The Republic was crumbling under the weight of its own compromises. And in the marble halls of the Senate, something no one, not even the Sith, had fully accounted for was about to happen. The galaxy's most dangerous war would be handed to a woman who had never wanted power, only peace. Coruscant's skies churned with the endless traffic of a Republic at war, troop transports, cruisers on layover from the Outer Rim, the distant flare of a Star Destroyer, prototype running trials over the atmosphere shipyards. Inside the Senate rotunda, none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence. Padme Amidala stood in the well of the chamber, her hands folded in front of her deep burgundy robes, and did not look at the Chancellor's dais. She had learned long ago not to give her opponents the satisfaction of watching her flinch. "The Senate will come to order," intoned Masameda, though his voice cracked slightly on the final word. 3 days. That was all it had taken to unmake a man who had held the Republic in his fist for the better part of a decade. 3 days since Bail Organa had stood before the assembled senators with a data crystal full of financial records connecting Chancellor Palpatine's office to bribery in the outer sectors. Records that, ironically, Palpatine himself had never authorized and did not entirely understand. Forged from threads Sidious hadn't bothered to cover because no one had ever dared look. 3 days since, Mon Mothma's coalition had grown from a fringe embarrassment into a wall of 200 votes. 3 days since the depth of the Republic's exhaustion, 2 years of war, of casualty lists, of shortages and propaganda had finally curdled into fury pointed squarely at the man holding emergency wartime powers. And 1 day since that fury had found a name to rally behind. Hers. She hadn't asked for this. She had stood at the podium fully, intending only to give another speech about the Military Creation Act, about the cost of endless authority granted and never returned. And somewhere in the middle of it, Chi-Ikwe Papanoida had shouted a nomination, and Tertaniel had seconded it, and the chamber had simply erupted. Now the vote was being tallied. Palpatine sat at the great curved dais overlooking the chamber, his face arranged into the same gentle, grandfatherly patience Padme had known for 20 years, since he had been a senator himself, since he had cheered when Naboo's queen strode into this very chamber to accuse the Trade Federation. He did not look like a man losing his grip on the galaxy. That, more than anything, unsettled her. "Senator Amidala," Masameda said, and the number scrolling above him froze. 2/3, more than 2/3. The Senate has voted, by emergency mandate, to install a new Supreme Chancellor for the duration of the crisis. Congratulations, Chancellor Amidala. The chamber didn't erupt into applause so much as into disbelief. 1,000 floating platforms buzzing with murmurs. Holographic delegates leaning toward each other. Droids recording every microsecond for 1,000 different homeworlds. Padme felt the moment slow down and stretch, the way it had the day she'd first been crowned Queen of Naboo at 14 years old, too young, too unready, and yet somehow the only one willing to stand up and be counted. She turned, finally, and met Palpatine's eyes. He rose from the dais with unhurried grace, crossed to her, and extended both hands to clasp hers in a gesture of public magnanimity. "The Republic is fortunate," he said, pitched to carry, warm and genuine to every ear in the chamber, to have a leader of such conviction, stepping forward in its hour of need. His grip lingered a fraction of a second too long. His eyes, up close, were not warm at all. "I look forward to serving under your guidance, Chancellor." Under my guidance. The word should have felt like victory. Instead, something cold moved through her, quick and formless as a shadow crossing a window, gone before she could name it. She had won. She told herself that as she took the podium the Senate staff had already, with impossible speed, retrofitted with the seal of her new office. She had won a battle 2 years of war, and 2 decades of political corruption had made her believe was unwinnable. A peaceful transfer of power, achieved through nothing but conviction and coalition, without a single shot fired. But as she looked down at the sea of senators, the Loyalist Committee, already reorganizing itself around her like iron filings around a new magnet, the separatist sympathizers watching with calculating stillness, the corporate and banking clan delegates doing silent math on their portfolios, she understood, with the clarity of a queen who had once faced down an invasion at 14. That winning the vote was the easiest part of what was coming. Somewhere above the city, in a coded transmission racing toward a listening post on Utapau, a message was already being prepared. The board has changed. Adjust accordingly. Padme did not know that message existed. She knew only that she had a war to end, a senate to heal, and a galaxy watching to see if idealism could survive contact with power. She began to speak. If you want to see more what if turning points reshape the galaxy far away, hit that subscribe button and drop a character or moment you'd want explored in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The office of the Supreme Chancellor still smelled faintly of Palpatine, rich Naboo incense, aged parchment, something metallic beneath it that Padme couldn't place until she realized. It was the ozone tinge of hidden security systems she hadn't yet been briefed on. She stood alone in the vast chamber for the first time since the ceremony. The transparent steel windows behind, the desk framing the endless spires of Coruscant's Senate District, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of what she'd taken on. Then the door chimed, and the 30 seconds were over. Chancellor Amidala. Palpatine's voice, still warm, still measured, though now it carried a new formality that made her skin prickle. He entered without waiting for permission, old habit. She told herself, 20 years in this office would do that to anyone, and inclined his head with perfect deference. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I thought it prudent we speak before you're buried beneath briefings. Of course, Senator. The title felt strange in her mouth. A demotion he wore like a comfortable coat. Please sit. He did, folding his hands in his lap with the unhurried patience of a man who had never once, in her experience, been in a hurry to say what he actually meant. I want you to know, he said, that whatever the Senate's grievances with my conduct of the war, I bear you no ill will. Quite the opposite. I have watched you since Naboo. I have always believed you capable of great things. I have always believed you capable of great things. The same words, she realized with a chill, that he had said to Anakin more times than she could count, compliments that felt less like praise and more like measurements being taken. I appreciate that, she said carefully. I hope you'll understand if I ask for your full cooperation during the transition. The Republic doesn't have the luxury of a slow handover, not with the Outer Rim sieges intensifying. Naturally, he rose, unbothered, and paused at the door. A word of caution, Chancellor, offered only in the spirit of long experience. Power in wartime is a strange thing. The Senate that begged you to save them from tyranny will, within a year, if not sooner, beg you for the very authorities they stripped from me. Idealism is a luxury the Republic affords its leaders only in peacetime. He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. I do hope you prove the exception. Then he was gone, and Padme stood alone with the uncomfortable sensation that she had just been warned and threatened in the same breath, wrapped so elegantly, in courtesy that she couldn't quite point to the moment the knife had gone in. She did not know, could not know, what was happening 3 floors below, in a private security suite stripped of Republic monitoring by authorizations. Palpatine had quietly never relinquished. Sidious stood in the dark, his public face discarded like a mask set down after a long performance. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to feel something close to fury. Amidala, of all the senators, of all the possible instruments the Loyalist committee might have raised against him, Mothma, too cautious, Organa, too visible a target, they had chosen the one person whose death he could not orchestrate without unraveling everything. Anakin Skywalker's devotion to her was not a variable in his plans. It was the foundation. Every fear he intended to cultivate in the boy, every carefully seeded nightmare of loss, every future manipulation toward the dark side ran through her like a vein of durasteel through rock. He could not simply have her removed. Not yet. Not without risking the very asset he had spent a decade grooming. He moved to the holodeble and activated a private channel, the blue static resolving into the hooded silhouette of Count Dooku, kneeling on some windswept balcony on Sereno. My master. Dooku's voice carried the faint edge of a question. He didn't dare voice directly. The Senate has made its move, Sidious said. and even filtered through the mask of Darth Sidious's rasp. The anger was unmistakable. Amidala sits in the Chancellor's seat. A long pause. This complicates the timeline considerably. It does not complicate anything, Sidious snapped, though the correction was as much for himself as for his apprentice. It delays. The war continues. The casualties mount. The Senate's patience for her idealism will fray precisely as it always does. And when it does, I will be waiting, not as a tyrant deposed, but as the reasonable alternative to chaos. He paused, considering. In the meantime, I want the pressure on the front lines increased. Feed her failures. Let her feel the true weight of command, the impossibility of fighting a war with clean hands. And Skywalker, Sidious's expression, hidden from Dooku but not from himself, flickered with something that might have been recalculation. Skywalker's attachment to her remains our greatest asset. It simply requires patience, a different architecture of fear. If she cannot be removed, then she must eventually be seen to fail him, or endangered by the very galaxy she believes she can save through decency. Alone, he extinguished the connection before Dooku could respond, and stood alone in the dark, already rebuilding a decade of careful architecture around one immovable, infuriating variable. Above him, unaware, Padme Amidala had already summoned her first war council. The Jedi Council chamber was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of silence that settled over a room full of people, choosing their words with unusual care. 12 chairs arranged in a circle beneath Coruscant's darkening sky, and in 11 of them, expressions ranging from cautious optimism to open skepticism. She fought for the Loyalist Committee for 2 years, Obi-Wan Kenobi said, standing near the transparent steel wall with his arms folded into his sleeves. She opposed the Military Creation Act before any of us saw the war coming. If anyone in the Senate has earned the benefit of the doubt, it's Padme Amidala. Earned trust and peace. This senator has, Yoda said from his hover chair, ears drooping in thought. Earned trust in war, a different matter, it is. Compassion, she carries in abundance. But compassion alone, win battles it does not. With respect, Master Yoda, Obi-Wan said, neither does cynicism. Mace Windu's dark eyes moved between them, weighing the exchange the way he weighed most things, slowly, and with the assumption that both sides were somewhat right and somewhat blind. The Council's concern isn't her character, he said. It's her authority. Palpatine held emergency powers granted by this same Senate. Powers this Council relied on to deploy the Grand Army without the usual bureaucratic paralysis. Chancellor Amidala has already indicated she intends to restore standard Senate oversight to military deployment. She believes the war is being prolonged by exactly the kind of unchecked authority Palpatine wielded. Obi-Wan said, she may not be wrong. She may also be about to lose Christoph Sis, Felucia, and half the Outer Rim while the Senate debates deployment resolutions. Windu said flatly, idealism is a Jedi virtue. It is not, historically, a virtue that wins wars. Across the chamber, Anakin Skywalker sat in the observer's seat reserved for generals not yet elevated to full council status, and said absolutely nothing, which was, for him, its own kind of loud. Yoda's gaze found him. Something to say, have you, Knight Skywalker? Every head turned. Anakin felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever this room looked at him too closely, as though they could see straight through his robes to the marriage he'd hidden from them for 3 years. He kept his voice level, only that the Council seems to be debating whether the Chancellor is fit to lead. When 2 days ago, half this room was relieved to see Palpatine gone. Relief and confidence are not the same thing, Windu said. No, Anakin agreed. But neither are caution and fairness. She hasn't failed yet. You're all just afraid she might. The silence that followed was not hostile, but it was heavy, and Obi-Wan shot his former Padawan a look that carried 20 years of tread carefully in it. Fear, an interesting word for a Jedi to use, Yoda said, not unkindly. When speaking of politics, Anakin held his ground. I've fought beside clones who die by the thousands because the Senate can't agree fast enough. If Chancellor Amidala can find a way to end this war without giving one person unlimited power to run it forever, I don't see why this council would call that dangerous instead of overdue. It was Windu, unexpectedly, who broke the tension, not by agreeing, but by redirecting. The council isn't debating whether she's dangerous, Skywalker. We're debating whether the Order should offer her our full confidence, or hold back enough distance to protect the war effort if her reforms fail. Those are different questions. He looked around the circle. I propose the council extend provisional support, full military cooperation, but someone should serve as direct liaison to the Chancellor's office, someone who can advise her on the realities of command without dictating to her, and report back to this council on how the transition affects our campaigns. Kenobi has history with her, Windu continued. Diplomatic experience. I'd suggest, Skywalker, Yoda said, and the single word landed in the chamber with the quiet finality of a decision already made, whether or not the rest of the council had caught up to it. Closest to her circumstances, he is. Trust her instincts. Does he? More than most in this room. Anakin's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the very secret this appointment threatened to expose to a room full of Force sensitives who made a profession of reading intention. Master Yoda, he started. I'm not sure that's. Objections, Master Kenobi? Windu asked, already sensing something unspoken passing between teacher and former student. Obi-Wan's face was carefully, professionally blank. None that I'd raise in council, Master Windu. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. Windu himself abstained. A silent flag planted in the middle of the councils. Cautious optimism, but it passed. Anakin Skywalker would serve as the Jedi Order's direct liaison to Chancellor Amidala's office, a position that would place him, by design and by the Force's own uncomfortable sense of irony, closer to his secret wife than he had been able to stand in over a year. As the council chamber emptied, Yoda lingered by the window, watching the traffic streams thread between the spires, and murmured to no one in particular. Curious, this alignment of stars is. Watch closely, we must, where it leads. He did not yet know how right he was. Anakin found her on the private terrace outside the Chancellor's residence. Half past midnight, still in her formal robes, though she'd shed the elaborate headpiece somewhere along the way, her dark hair falling loose down her back. Coruscant sprawled beneath them in endless bands of light. And for a moment, he simply stood in the doorway and let himself look at her, without the weight of the galaxy pressing down on either of them. They told me the council assigned a liaison, she said without turning around. I didn't expect it to be you. Neither did I. He crossed the terrace and stood beside her at the railing, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, careful the way they were always careful in spaces that weren't fully private. Yoda suggested it himself. Windu abstained. I don't think he trusts the timing. He shouldn't. Padme's mouth curved, tired but genuine. I don't fully trust the timing either. 3 days ago, I was a senator writing amendments no one would pass. Now I'm the chancellor of a galaxy at war, and my liaison to the Jedi Order is my husband. She finally looked at him. Say it isn't complicated, Ani. I dare you. It's complicated, he admitted, and something in his chest loosened just slightly at the honesty of it, at being able to say true things to her even when the truths were hard. I should feel proud. I do feel proud. You did something no one thought was possible. You beat him without a single shot fired. But, she echoed. He turned fully to face her, and the fear he'd been holding, since the Senate vote came up through him raw and unpolished, the way it always did with her. The one place his careful Jedi composure simply refused to hold. But I keep thinking about everyone who's ever tried to fix this war, this Senate, this whole rotten system, and how it's chewed them up. I think about what happens to you if you fail. I think about what happens to you if you succeed, and the kind of enemies that makes. His jaw tightened. Palpatine didn't even look angry when he lost. That should terrify you more than if he had. It does, she said quietly. I'm not naive, Anakin. I know exactly what I've stepped into. I know he's not simply going to retire to Naboo and Tende Garden. She looked back out at the city. But I also know that if I don't try, if no one tries, then the only future this galaxy has is one where wartime power keeps consolidating in fewer and fewer hands until there's no republic left to save. Someone has to prove democracy can survive a war. I would rather it be me and fail than watch someone I love become the excuse for it to die quietly. He didn't answer that directly, because there was nothing To say to it that wouldn't sound like asking her to be smaller than she was. And he had promised himself a long time ago he would never be the reason she folded herself down to fit inside someone else's fear. Instead, he reached over and laced his fingers through hers, mechanical hand and human hand both, and said, "Then I suppose I'm exactly where I should be. Close enough to help. Close enough to see it coming, if something's wrong." "The council doesn't know," she said. "About us?" "No. A beat. It's harder now, being this close to you, in the temple's own reports, in briefings that go straight to the council. I have to be careful in a way I've never had to be careful before." He hesitated. "I don't regret it. I want you to know that. Whatever it costs, whatever comes next, I don't regret a single day of this." Her fingers tightened around his. Below them, a formation of gunships thundered, passed on their way to the war staging platforms. Above the Senate district, a reminder, as if either of them needed one, that whatever peace existed on this terrace was borrowed against a much larger and much crueler clock. "I need you to promise me something," Padme said. "Anything. If I start becoming someone you don't recognize, if this office starts changing me the way it changed him, I need you to tell me. Not the council, not Obi-Wan. Me first, before anyone else." Her eyes were fierce in the low light, the same fierceness he remembered from a 14-year-old queen who had once looked an invading army in the eye and refused to blink. "I've watched power corrupt smarter people than me. I won't pretend I'm immune simply because I mean well. I promise," he said, and meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything in his life. He didn't tell her the shape of his own private fear, that it wasn't her becoming someone corrupted by power that terrified him, but the galaxy deciding she was too dangerous, too effective, too inconvenient to be allowed to keep succeeding. He didn't yet have a name for the thing coiling somewhere beneath Coruscant's surface, recalculating, patient, and hungry. He only knew, with the instinct that had kept him alive through 100 battles, that something was watching them both and waiting. Above them, the city burned on, indifferent and beautiful, and for one more night, that was enough. The first full session of the reconstituted War Council convened 4 days after Padme's inauguration, and by the end of the first hour, she understood precisely why Palpatine had preferred to rule by decree. The war room beneath the Chancellor's tower was a wide amphitheater of hollow displays, showing troop deployments across a dozen active fronts, staffed by officers, senators, and Jedi generals who had spent 2 years accustomed to receiving orders rather than debating them. Padme stood at the center table, Bail Organa and Mon Mothma flanking her like the coalition allies they were, and laid out the first 3 reforms she intended to push through the Senate within the month. "Clone rights legislation," she said, and the room's temperature seemed to drop a degree. "Basic protections, medical care commensurate with what we provide non-clone officers, formal recognition of individual identity and service records, and an end to the disposability doctrine currently baked into deployment strategy." She met the eyes of General Kenobi's logistics liaison, an older man named Colonel Vey, who had not bothered to hide his skepticism since she'd entered the room. "I've read the casualty projections that treat clone losses as an acceptable operational cost because the Kaminoans can simply grow more. I find that math morally unacceptable and, frankly, strategically short-sighted. Soldiers who believe their lives have inherent value fight differently than soldiers who've been told their inventory." "Chancellor," Colonel Tan said carefully, with respect, "reworking supply and deployment doctrine mid-war risks." "I'm aware of the risks," Padme said. "I'm also aware that we have been fighting this war for 2 years using doctrine built by men who have never once asked the clones fighting it what they think of their own expendability. The legislation moves forward." The second reform met even fiercer resistance. A formal proposal to open back-channel peace negotiations with moderate factions within the Separatist Alliance, particularly systems that had joined Dooku's Confederacy, not out of ideological conviction, but out of justified grievance against Republic taxation and Trade Federation exploitation. "You want to negotiate with the people currently trying to kill our soldiers," said Senator Fong Zar, arms crossed, his hologram flickering with the transmission delay from CERN Prime. "I want to identify which of our Soldiers' deaths are strategically necessary and which are the result of a war both sides have stopped remembering how to end, Padme said. Not every separatist system wants Dooku's Sith patron any more than we want Republic corruption. If even a handful of border systems can be peeled away from the Confederacy through negotiation instead of invasion, that's fewer battles, fewer casualties, and a faster path to an actual resolution instead of a war of attrition neither side can sustain forever. Obi-Wan, seated among the assembled Jedi generals, spoke for the first time. Chancellor, I don't disagree with the principle, but you should know, separatist command structure isn't uniform. Some systems joined willingly. Others were coerced, economically or militarily, identifying which is which safely, without exposing negotiators to ambush, will require significant intelligence, work the Republic currently doesn't have in place. Then we build it, Padme said. General Kenobi, I'd like the 212ths Intelligence Division to begin, quietly identifying negotiation candidates. Discreetly. I don't want this leaked to the HoloNet before we've made contact. The last thing I need is Confederate hardliners executing moderates who might have come to the table. It was the third proposal that finally cracked the room's composure entirely. A formal audit, Padme said, of all military contracts issued during the previous administration, specifically contracts routed through the banking clan, Quadrive Yards, and any entity with financial ties to Chancellor Palpatine's former office. The silence that followed was not merely uncomfortable. It was the silence of powerful men doing rapid, private math about their own exposure. Chancellor, said a Quat liaison seated near the back, his voice carefully neutral. That audit would touch nearly every major shipbuilding contract of the war. Good, Padme said. Then we'll finally know whether the Republic has been paying fair prices for its own survival or subsidizing the fortunes of people profiting from every death this war produces. She looked around the table, meeting each gaze in turn, letting the silence do the work. Rhetoric couldn't. I did not take this office to manage a war efficiently. I took it to end one, honestly, and to make sure the Republic that exists on the other side of it is one worth having survived for. If that makes powerful people uncomfortable, I'd invite them to ask themselves why. After the session broke, Bail Organa fell into step beside her in the corridor, his expression a careful mixture of admiration and warning. That was either the bravest thing I've seen in the Senate in a decade, he said, or the fastest way to make yourself a very long list of enemies. Why not both? Padme said. Because both gets people killed, Padme. Bail's voice dropped, serious now. I've watched Coruscant politics eat reformers alive before. The audit alone will threaten contracts worth more than the GDP of a dozen systems. Someone is going to push back, quietly and hard. She thought of Palpatine's parting words in her office. Idealism is a luxury the Republic affords its leaders only in peacetime, and felt the cold certainty settle into her chest that Bail was right, and that she had already decided it didn't matter. Let them push, she said. I didn't come this far to govern carefully. Somewhere in the depths of Coruscant's financial district, in offices belonging to men whose fortunes had quietly financed both sides of the war for 2 profitable years. That promise was already being received as a declaration of war. The attack came 11 days later, and it was, in its own way, a masterpiece of deniability. Padme was addressing the Refugee Relief Committee in the lower Senate levels, a gathering of aid coordinators from a dozen war-torn systems. Unglamorous work that generated no headlines and, until recently, no security concerns. When the first explosion tore through the building's eastern support column, the chamber lurched, transparent steel panels spider-webbing across the far wall, and the emergency lighting flooded the room in urgent red as alarms began screaming through the corridors. Down. Anakin was already moving before the sound of the blast had finished rolling. Through the chamber, one arm sweeping Padme beneath the reinforced dais table as debris rained from the ceiling, his lightsaber igniting in his other hand before he'd even fully processed what he was reacting to. Around them, aid workers and junior senators scrambled for cover, screaming, the acrid smell of scorched durasteel and ozone thick enough to taste. Report. Padme shouted over the alarms, already reaching for the comlink. At her belt, even as Anakin's body shielded hers from the ceiling's continued collapse. Multiple charges, came the clipped voice of Captain Typho, her head of security, from somewhere in the chaos beyond the chamber doors. East support, sublevel access. And, Chancellor, get out of there. There's a second wave. The second explosion came from below rather than above, the floor itself heaving upward in a shower of duracrete and twisted rebar. And this time Anakin didn't hesitate. He caught Padme bodily and threw them both clear as a support pillar buckled and crashed down exactly where they'd been standing seconds before, the force singing through his limbs with the particular clarity that came only in moments where hesitation meant death. Move. Now, toward the west exit, he snapped. And she didn't argue, running low with his hand locked around her wrist. The two of them weaving through a chamber that had gone from bureaucratic tedium to a war zone in under 90 seconds. Behind them, 3 more explosions walked across the structure in a deliberate, professional pattern, not random terrorism, but a controlled demolition sequence to collapse the entire wing. They made it to the west corridor as the ceiling finally gave way behind them. A wall of dust and debris slamming shut the path they'd just cleared, and Padme found herself gasping against a support column. Anakin's arms still braced protectively across her chest, both of them coated in gray dust, hearts hammering. "You're hurt," he said, seeing the blood at her hairline where debris had caught her. "I'm alive," she corrected, which, judging by the precision of that, was not guaranteed. She looked at him, and something cold and analytical pushed through the adrenaline. That wasn't separatist. Separatist attacks on Coruscant are messy. They want casualties and headlines. This was engineered to look like structural failure. Someone wanted this deniable. By the time Republic security had swept the wreckage, and Captain Typho had confirmed no fatalities, beyond 2 aid workers caught in the initial blast, a fact that haunted Padme far more than the attempt on her own life. The investigation had already split into 2 competing theories, and the division itself told her something important. Separatist saboteurs, insisted General Rex's counterpart in Republic intelligence, presenting fragments of detonator casing matching designs, previously used by Confederate cells, consistent with prior attacks on Republic infrastructure. Too consistent, Obi-Wan said quietly, examining the same fragments in the makeshift command post they'd established in an intact wing of the Senate building. Separatist saboteurs don't typically leave this much forensic evidence intact. It's either remarkably sloppy work from an organization that has been anything but sloppy for 2 years, or someone wanted us to find exactly this and stop looking further. Padme, cleaned up now, a back-to-patch at her temple, sat at the head of the table and said nothing for a long moment, turning the political geometry of the attack over in her mind. "The audit," she finally said. "I announced it 11 days ago. This happens the same week that banking clan liaisons were due to submit financial records. You think this is connected to the contracts investigation?" Bale said. "Not quite a question. I think," Padme said carefully, "that whoever benefits from this war, continuing exactly as it has been run for 2 years, has just demonstrated they're willing to kill to keep it that way. Whether that's separatist opportunists exploiting the chaos, war profiteers protecting their contracts, or something else entirely, I don't yet know. But I intend to find out." She looked to Anakin, who had not left her side since the corridor, his jaw set in a way she recognized from every difficult battle he'd ever come home from. "And I want the audit expedited, not shelved. If someone's trying to frighten me into abandoning it, that's the clearest confirmation yet that it needs to happen." What none of them knew, what even Obi-Wan's considerable instincts for the currents beneath Coruscant's surface couldn't detect, was that the attack had been engineered with genuine, deliberate imprecision, real enough to terrify, calculated enough to fail. Sidious had not wanted Padme Amidala dead. Not yet. He had wanted her afraid, wanted the Republic to see its idealistic new Chancellor bleeding in a collapsed chamber, wanted the seeds of doubt about whether decency could survive contact with a galaxy this cruel. He had, however, badly underestimated how thoroughly that fear would calcify into resolve instead of retreat, and worse, he had not accounted for how The attack would reshape the one variable he could least afford to lose control of. 3 floors above the wreckage. Alone in the Jedi Temple's meditation chambers that night, Anakin Skywalker sat with his eyes closed and his fists clenched, replaying the sound of that second explosion over and over, and felt something old and familiar stir awake in the dark part of himself he usually kept carefully, deliberately still. The message arrived through channels that should not have existed. A diplomatic back frequency reserved for pre-war. Separatist trade negotiations, dormant for 2 years. Suddenly active again with an encryption signature that made Republic Intelligence's Cryptography Division sit up in alarm. I request an audience with Chancellor Amidala. Alone, or with escort of her choosing. I give my word as a former Jedi that no harm will come to her under flag of parley. Count Dooku. Padme read the transcript 3 times. In the privacy of her office before summoning her war council, and even then, she noted the room's reaction. With the same careful attention, she gave every political tremor. Since the bombing 11 days prior, Windu's expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of answer. Obi-Wan's did. A flicker of something between suspicion and cautious hope. The look of a man who had once called Dooku friend and had never fully stopped wondering what might have been salvaged. It's a trap, said Colonel Tan flatly. It might be, Windu said. Dooku doesn't do anything without his master's knowledge. If Sidious wants the Chancellor exposed, there is no Sidious in this room's official understanding. Padme said carefully, watching the Jedi Master's face for a reaction. She had her suspicions about what the Council knew or half knew regarding a hidden Sith Lord, suspicions fed by Anakin's guarded silences on the subject. But no one had yet said the name aloud to her directly. There is a confederacy led by a Sith Lord training a fallen Jedi as his enforcer. I'm aware of the danger. General Windu. I'm asking whether the offer has strategic value, independent of the source's motives. Dooku's offers are never independent of his motives, Obi-Wan said. But there was less certainty in it than his words suggested. That said, I don't discount the possibility that he's acting outside his master's direct instruction. Dooku is proud. If he believes the war's trajectory has shifted since your election, he may be positioning himself for peace or simply for advantage, depending on which serves him better. Either way, Padme said, refusing to even hear the offer accomplishes nothing except confirming to the galaxy that this Republic has no interest in ending the war through anything but total military victory. I campaigned against exactly that kind of thinking. She agreed to the meeting, over the strenuous objection of nearly everyone in the room. With 2 conditions: it would take place aboard a neutral Republic cruiser in orbit rather than separatist territory, and Anakin would accompany her, not as Jedi liaison, but as personal security. A distinction that satisfied no one's actual concerns, but that the Council, still unaware of exactly how personal that security truly was, accepted without further debate. Dooku arrived alone, as promised, beamed aboard the radiant truth in the black and silver robes of Sereno nobility, his lightsaber visibly present but not drawn, his bearing the unhurried aristocratic calm Padme remembered from their handful of prior encounters, back when he'd merely been a controversial former Jedi rather than the architect of a galactic civil war. Chancellor Amidala. He inclined his head with old-world formality. You look remarkably well, for a woman who survived a bombing 11 days ago. You'll forgive me if I don't take the observation as concern, Padme said. Beside her, Anakin stood with his hand resting near his lightsaber hilt, his eyes fixed on Dooku with an intensity that bordered on hostility, an old wound from Geonosis that had never fully closed. Skywalker. Dooku's gaze flicked to him, something almost amused in it, still so quick to anger. I'd hoped prison hadn't done to you what it's done to so many soldiers, hardened the reflex, dulled the reflection. Say what you came to say, Dooku, Anakin said. Very well. Dooku's expression settled into something more serious. I propose a limited armistice, not a full peace. I have no illusions the Senate would accept unconditional separatist withdrawal any more than my systems would accept unconditional surrender. But a cessation of hostilities across 3 sectors, Sertar, Kessel Run Periphery, and the Ando systems, for a period of 90 days, during which formal negotiators from both sides establish Terms for a broader resolution. Padme kept her expression neutral, though her mind was already running the calculus. Why these 3 sectors? Because they are the ones my current allies care least about defending, and yours care least about liberating, Dooku said with a thin smile. Practical peace begins where the stakes are lowest, Chancellor. You know this. It's why your legislative career was built on incrementalism rather than grand gestures. And your master approves of this offer? Padme asked directly. Something flickered behind Dooku's composed features, brief, controlled, but unmistakable, to a woman who had spent 2 decades reading the faces of senators, lying to her. My master, he said carefully, concerns himself with the war's broader trajectory. The details of specific sectors are, appropriately, left to my judgment as military commander. He's acting without full authorization, Padme realized, and felt the shape of an opportunity take form, not necessarily a path to trust Dooku, but a possible fracture in the Sith's total control of the war's direction, a crack she might be able to widen. I'll take the proposal to my war council, she said. I make no promises, but I don't dismiss it out of hand, either. That, Dooku said, rising to signal the meetings, and is more than I received from your predecessor. In a decade of trying, perhaps the Republic has finally found a leader willing to risk peace, instead of merely enduring war. He paused at the edge of the transport pad. Do be careful, Chancellor. Ambition wears many faces in this galaxy, and not all of them announce themselves as clearly as mine. He was gone before she could ask what he meant by it, leaving her with a fragile, dangerous olive branch and the unshakable sense that she had just glimpsed, however briefly, the first hairline crack in a partnership the galaxy assumed was unbreakable. The armistice proposal detonated through the Senate like a second bombing, though this one, at least, was entirely political. 3 days of furious debate followed, Hawks accusing Padme of legitimizing terrorism, Doves calling it the first real hope for peace since the war began, separatist sympathizing delegations quietly celebrating what they read as the beginning of Republic capitulation. In the end, the armistice passed by the narrowest margin of Padme's young chancellorship, and the guns fell silent across 3 sectors for the first time in 2 years. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it was in the quiet aftermath of that fight. While reviewing military logistics reports to confirm troop withdrawal from the newly demilitarized sectors, that Padme found the anomaly that would keep her awake for the better part of a week. It was buried in a routine appropriations request from Kamino, a supplementary training directive, filed 18 months earlier under Palpatine's administration, requesting expanded behavioral conditioning protocols for the clone Army's command structure. On its surface, unremarkable, the Kaminoans had submitted dozens of similar requests over the course of the war, refinements to loyalty programming that Republic oversight had rubber-stamped without much scrutiny, more concerned with troop numbers than psychological architecture. What caught her attention was the directive's designation, Contingency Order 66, cross-referenced against a classification tier so restrictive that even her Chancellor-level clearance only granted partial access. The visible portion described it in bloodless bureaucratic language as a protocol for command, restructuring in the event of Jedi Order treason against the Supreme Chancellor. The rest was locked behind clearance she did not, apparently, possess, despite holding the highest civilian office in the galaxy. She sat with that for a long time. Anakin, she said, when he arrived for their evening briefing, and found her still at her desk long after the office had emptied, the holoprojector casting the directive's fragmentary text across her face in pale blue light. What do you know about clone command contingency protocols? He frowned, crossing to look at the display. Standard stuff. Chain of command fallback procedures if a general's killed in action. That kind of thing. Why? Because there's a directive buried in Kamino's training protocols that I can't fully access, even with Chancellor-level clearance. That appears to authorize the clone Army to treat the Jedi Order as hostile combatants under specific, unspecified conditions. She turned the display toward him. Contingency Order 66. Authorized 18 months ago, before I took office. Something crossed Anakin's face that she couldn't quite name. Not confusion. Exactly, but the particular. stillness of a man encountering a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture he thought he understood, and didn't like the shape of the gap it revealed. That doesn't make sense. The clones are loyal. I've fought beside them for 2 years. Rex would never. The chips are just standard command compliance protocols. Every clone has them. It's basic military discipline architecture. Chips? Padme asked. Inhibitor chips. Biological command compliance. He said it the way a man recites something he's been told, rather than something he's investigated. And she watched him hear his own words and pause. I've never actually seen the full specification. It's a Kaminoan medical matter, not something Field Command typically reviews. I want it reviewed, Padme said. Quietly. I don't want this going through official channels yet, not until I understand who authorized a contingency protocol that specifically targets the Jedi Order, using an army the Jedi Order commands, without that order's knowledge or the Senate's oversight. She met his eyes. Anakin, if I'm reading this correctly, someone built a mechanism over a year ago to potentially turn every clone soldier against every Jedi general simultaneously, on command. That's not standard military contingency planning. That's a loaded weapon pointed at the only military force capable of checking abuse of civilian power. The color had gone out of his face by the time she finished, though she couldn't have said whether it was fear for the Jedi, fear for her, or some deeper unease he wasn't yet willing to name even to himself. Who has clearance to unlock the rest of it? That's the other thing, Padme said quietly. The clearance tier isn't civilian at all. It's keyed to a designation I don't recognize, something outside the normal military or Senate hierarchy entirely. Whoever built this protocol answers to an authority that exists outside my office's visibility, which means either the previous administration hid an entire shadow command structure inside the clone Army's core programming, or she stopped herself, unwilling to say the rest of the thought aloud, though she could see in Anakin's face that he'd already leapt to some version of the same terrible possibility. I'll talk to Rex, Anakin said finally, his voice low and controlled in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something back by force of will. Quietly. See what he knows, if anything. If there's a chip, if it can be. He didn't finish that sentence either. Anakin. She caught his hand as he turned to go, and for a moment the Chancellor and the General fell away. And it was just the two of them. The way it had been on the terrace weeks ago. Two people trying to hold on to something honest inside a galaxy built on secrets. Be careful. If I found something someone went to considerable lengths to keep buried, they will not be pleased to learn we're looking. I'm always careful, he said, with a ghost of his old easy smile that didn't fully reach his eyes. He left, and Padme sat alone with the locked directive still glowing on her desk. The phrase authority that exists outside my office's visibility turning over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop touching, and somewhere in the recesses of political instinct honed across a lifetime of reading what people didn't say, she understood, with growing dread, that she had just found the edge of something far larger and far darker than a single corrupt contract or a single bombing. She simply did not yet have a name for it. Sidious felt the Chancellor's inquiry into Order 66. The way a spider feels a single strand of its web tremble, not alarm. Exactly, but immediate, focused attention. Palpatine's information network, though stripped of official authority, remained vast and largely intact. A senator's aide here, a Kaminoan administrator there. Threads of loyalty and blackmail spun across 2 decades that no Senate vote could unravel overnight. Within hours of Padme's quiet inquiry reaching Kamino's records division, word of it reached him through channels Chancellor Amidala didn't yet know existed. He sat alone in his private chambers, modest rooms now, a senator's allotment rather than a chancellor's palace. A demotion he wore in public with perfect equanimity and experienced in private as a slow, banked fury, and understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 40 years planning contingencies within contingencies, that the timeline had just fractured beyond his ability to fully control it. She cannot be allowed to unlock that directive. Not because Order 66 itself would be understood. The full architecture of the command was buried behind encryption. Even Republic intelligence's finest cryptographers would need months to crack, but because the investigation itself would draw exactly the kind of institutional scrutiny His entire design depended on avoiding. If the Jedi Council learned a mechanism existed to turn their own army against them, they would move to disable it. If the Senate learned it, they would demand to know who had authorized it. And that thread, pulled far enough, led inexorably back to a name he could not yet afford spoken aloud in the full light of Republic law. He made a decision he had avoided for 11 days: direct action. The message he sent to Dooku that night carried no diplomatic flourishes. The Chancellor has stumbled onto the contingency architecture. She must be removed from access to Kamino's classified records before the investigation matures, whatever measures are required. Dooku's reply, when it came, carried something Sidious hadn't anticipated in his apprentice's voice: hesitation. My lord, the armistice negotiations are at a delicate stage. An attack on the Chancellor now, so soon after the bombing, would collapse the peace process entirely and unite the Senate against the Confederacy in a way 2 years of war has not managed. You would advise me on strategy, Count? Sidious's fury, unleashed now, crackled through the connection with enough force-charged intensity that Dooku, hundreds of light years away on Sereno, actually flinched. You forget your place. The armistice was never meant to bring peace. It was meant to buy time. If the Chancellor's continued survival threatens the greater design, her survival becomes negotiable. A long silence. Then, quieter. Understood, my master. I will make arrangements. But something in that silence, something Sidious, blinded by urgency, failed to fully register, was the sound of a proud man's loyalty developing its first genuine fracture. The sound of a count who had begun to wonder, in the privacy of his own calculations, whether the Sith's endgame truly served the galaxy he had once, long ago, sworn as a Jedi to protect. The attack came 2 nights later. Not at the Senate, not at the Chancellor's residence, both now ringed with security. That made direct assault suicidal, but at Kamino itself, where Anakin and a small team of clone troopers under Rex's command had traveled to physically access the classified server core that housed Order 60 SIXS full specification. The strike force that hit the cloning facility was not separatist. It moved with a precision and discipline that Rex, watching the sensor readouts with a cold feeling he couldn't name, recognized immediately as trained, Republic trained, even in ways that made no sense until the attackers breached the outer perimeter and he saw, beneath tactical armor stripped of any unit insignia, the unmistakable bearing of Kaminoan security forces turned against the very Jedi they'd been building an army to serve. Anakin, Rex's voice, cracked through comms as the first exchange of blaster fire lit up the rain-slicked platform outside the primary cloning tower. This isn't separatist tech. These are our people. Someone's turned our own security forces. Anakin didn't have time to process the full implications before the facility's central server vault, the one thing they'd come to protect, erupted in a precisely placed thermal charge, sending decades of Kaminoan cloning data and the complete, unredacted specification of Order 66 up in a column of fire and smoke that lit up the storm-dark sky. He fought through the chaos with a ferocity that surprised even Rex, cutting through the false flag strike team with a speed and lethality that bordered on something darker than standard Jedi combat doctrine, driven by an understanding, crystallizing in real time, that this had never been about Kamino's records at all. It had been about making sure no one, ever, could prove what those records contained. By the time the last attacker fell and the vault's fires were finally contained, the evidence was gone, reduced to slag and ash. The classified tier that might have named who truly held authority over Order 66 destroyed as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Anakin stood in the wreckage, rain mixing with soot on his face, and calmed Padme directly, his voice raw with an anger he didn't fully understand yet, only felt, burning through him like something he'd have to work very hard later, not to let consume him entirely. It's gone, he said. All of it. Someone burned it rather than let us see what it really was. A pause, heavy with everything neither of them could yet name. Padme, whoever did this, they're not separatist. They're inside the Republic. Inside us. And they just prove they'll destroy anything. Kill anyone, to keep us from finding out who they are. On the other end of the transmission, In the Chancellor's office high above Coruscant, Padme closed her eyes and, for the first time since taking office, allowed herself to feel truly afraid, not for herself, but for the shape of the thing she now understood was hunting them both from somewhere just beyond the edge of what either of them could yet see. The trail, in the end, did not lead where either of them expected, not to a boardroom of war profiteers, not even fully to a Confederate conspiracy, but to a name that had been sitting in plain sight for 20 years, hidden behind decades of grandfatherly smiles and impeccable public service. It was Obi-Wan who found the thread that finally pulled the whole tapestry loose, cross-referencing the encrypted clearance tier from the destroyed Kamino directive against a decades-old security registry buried in Republic intelligence archives, a registry that predated the war entirely. Back to Padme's own days as Queen of Naboo. The designation matched a private security classification issued to exactly one person in the galaxy, a senator, later chancellor, who had quietly accumulated shadow authority over military contingency planning years before anyone thought to question why a legislator needed it. It's him, Obi-Wan said, standing in Padme's office with a data slate trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand, the calm Jedi composure cracking under the weight of what he was holding. Chancellor, Senator, Palpatine authorized Order 66. Before the war even began, it's been sitting inside the clone army's command architecture since Geonosis. The revelation detonated through the small circle who received it. Padme, Anakin, Obi-Wan, Windu, Bail, with the particular horror of a truth too large to immediately comprehend. It explained the bombing's strange imprecision. It explained Dooku's hesitation, the crack Padme had glimpsed aboard the radiant truth. It explained, with sickening clarity, exactly what kind of galaxy Palpatine had spent 2 decades quietly building toward, one contingency at a time, waiting for the moment unlimited power could be seized as the only rational response to chaos he himself had engineered. What followed was not a lightsaber duel in a chancellor's office, not a dramatic unmasking before the full Senate. It was something Padme insisted on, over every instinct the Jedi in the room carried toward direct confrontation. Due process, weaponized with total precision. Evidence assembled in absolute secrecy. Kamino's remaining backup archives seized under Republic intelligence authority before Palpatine's network could reach them. Dooku reached through the same backchannel that had opened the armistice. And now, faced with proof his master had ordered his own death as an acceptable cost, given a choice Sidious had never imagined he'd need to offer his apprentice, provided testimony that would never see a public courtroom. But that confirmed, absolutely, the architecture of a Sith conspiracy decades in the making. The arrest came at dawn. Clone troopers whose inhibitor chips had been quietly, urgently deactivated, across every garrison in Coruscant's orbit in the 72 hours prior. A covert operation Anakin and Rex, executed with a speed born of pure desperation surrounding Palpatine's private residence, with Jedi Council authorization and Senate warrant both in hand. He did not resist, not physically. He simply looked at Padme, standing at the head of the arrest detail beside Windu and Anakin, and smiled the same warm, grandfatherly smile he'd worn the day he lost the chancellorship. "You've done something remarkable, my dear," he said, as the binders closed around his wrists. "You've proven the Republic can still surprise even me. I do wonder, in the years to come, whether you'll thank yourself for it, or curse the day you didn't simply let the galaxy burn the way it wanted to." "The galaxy didn't want to burn," Padme said. "You just spent 20 years convincing it there was no other choice." He said nothing further. There was, in the end, nothing further to say. The war did not end that day. Sidious's fall fractured the Confederacy's command structure into chaos. Dooku's quiet withdrawal from active leadership, leaving a power vacuum that would take painful months of negotiation, skirmish, and diplomacy to resolve. But it changed irrevocably. The machinery of manufactured conflict finally exposed to the light. The endless war of attrition giving way, slowly and imperfectly, to the armistice Padme had first opened as a fragile, doubted gamble. 6 months later, standing again on the terrace outside the Chancellor's residence, Padme watched the traffic streams below with a stillness she hadn't felt since before the Senate vote that started it all. Anakin's hand found hers in the dark, no longer entirely a secret, not fully public, but no longer hidden from the small circle of people who had helped save the Republic and, in doing so, earned the right to know the truth of what she carried. "We did it," he said quietly. "We survived it," she corrected gently. "There's a difference. The war isn't over. The Republic isn't healed. But it's ours again, not something being managed towards someone else's design." She looked at him, and for the first time in months, allowed herself the small, fierce hope she'd carried since she was 14 years old and had refused to let an invading army decide her people's future for them. That has to be enough for now. Below them, the galaxy turned on, wounded and uncertain, but no longer blind. In the years that followed, historians would argue endlessly over what truly saved the Republic: the armistice, the exposure of Sidious, or simply the stubborn refusal of one senator turned chancellor to believe that decency and power were mutually exclusive. The war ground toward its difficult, imperfect end, and the Jedi Order, shaken by how close it had come to unwitting genocide, began the slow work of questioning traditions it had never before dared examine. Anakin Skywalker walked a harder, freer path than the one fate had written for him. His marriage no longer a secret weight dragging him toward darkness, but a truth that had, in the end, helped save them both. And Padme Amidala governed not as a savior, but as proof that the Republic's oldest ideal, that power belonged to the people, not to whoever seized it first, could still, against every cynical prediction, survive contact with the dark.